this pre-birth matching was often became a way that pregnant people felt that they owed this couple, and it was almost always a couple, but these prospective parents their child, right? And one mother I interviewed talked about like going out to dinner with her son's prospective adoptive parents while she was still pregnant. And they have had their 4-year-old with them, and the 4-year-old at dinner is like drawing a picture on the placemat, like, oh, this is you, and this is my baby brother in your belly, right? And this sort of way that she felt indebted to not just the parents, but to the child, to their whole family, to the extent that she felt that she'd be letting them down if she didn't give them her child.
This is What Next, the Adoptee Rights Podcast. I'm Gregory Luce, the Executive Director of Adoptees United and an adoptee rights lawyer. I'm also an adopted person, born and adopted in the District of Columbia. In each episode of What Next, I talk about what's on our minds, whether it's the state of adopted people and adoptee rights around the world, legislative issues, interviews, or the frequent absurdities and complications of being an adopted person. This episode is the podcast version of our conversation with Gretchen Sisson, author of Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. We had that conversation by Zoom, which is also recorded and released as a video for those who attended. I am super excited to introduce our guest. And Dr. Gretchen Sisson is a sociologist who studies abortion and adoption in the United States. She is a researcher at Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health, part of the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. She is the author of what we'll be talking about tonight, Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood, and which was just published at the end of February. Her studies on adoption include hundreds of in-depth interviews with women who have relinquished infants for domestic adoption over the past 60 years, with a particular focus on women who have relinquished since Roe v. Wade. Her research examining adoption decision-making after abortion denial as part of the Turnaway study, and you'll hear a little bit more about that, was cited in the Supreme Court's dissent in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health from Justices Breyer, Kagan, and Sotomayor. So welcome, Gretchen. If you could just say a few words and tell us how you're doing, actually.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm really, really excited to be here tonight. I was just telling Greg and some of the fellow Adoptees United board members, I've been on book tour for the last 2 weeks, most of it. And I've been having a lot of conversations with a lot of folks who have never thought deeply about adoption before, which is exciting because I want them to be thinking more deeply about adoption. But I'm also really excited to be with a group of people where we can have a little bit of a deeper conversation around a lot of these issues, because I know obviously a lot of you have been living it your entire lives. So I'm excited to be here, be in community with you all. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Gretchen. And then, we sort of made the assumption that we're not going to have to do the very basics of what adoption is and what it involves. We're assuming everyone really knows that, as most of the people attending live that. So we can really dig into some of the deeper questions and some of the deeper issues that come up. One thing I want to know, sort of the history of the book and where is it coming from? I understand it comes from quite a long time ago when you were doing research and maybe even volunteering at I believe a abortion related funding group. But tell us about how you got started on the research and the writing of the book.
Yeah, so the research started long before I knew that I was writing a book. So I started doing this research when I was a graduate student in Boston. And that was back in 2009, 2010 that I started doing a lot of this work. And a lot of folks ask me if I am an adoptee, if I'm a birth mother. I'm not, I don't have a personal connection to adoption. But I came to this work when I was in grad school. I was working with an organization called the Alliance on Teen Pregnancy in Boston at the time. And we were doing a lot of work with young parents, working on the pregnant and parenting student policy at the Boston Public Schools, working on making sure that these young parents, teen parents, really could get access to the childcare that they needed, the housing that they needed. A lot of the mothers that we worked with were foster impacted themselves, and were struggling to find housing where they could then raise their children. So we were doing a lot of this work around what it actually means to support vulnerable families. I was also, as you mentioned, volunteering at the abortion fund at the time. So I was doing a lot of work in different areas of like reproductive health, support for families, and what it really means to give people control over their reproductive lives. And I always tell the story. This was the summer that 16 and Pregnant started airing on MTV. And they had these specific arcs around what teen motherhood looked like. And then they had this episode about Caitlin and Tyler, who were a couple who relinquished their daughter. And the whole narrative, right, was that they were better parents than their peers who were parenting, right? That by virtue of relinquishing their daughter, they had demonstrated that they were more mature, more responsible, more loving in a lot of ways. And I'm looking at these young women that I'm working with at the Alliance on how incredible they are, how much work they're doing to advocate for what they need for their families, and the ways that their parenthood is like continually stigmatized and marginalized. And it really made me want to understand the way that we perceive of adoption as like a panacea, right? We don't need to invest in these families over here if they should just be giving their babies to other families, right? We don't need to invest in abortion access or consider what that really means if adoption is the solution. Solution in quotes, strong quotes. And so the ways that adoption kept kind of cropping up in my work as this counterpoint, right, made me want to understand how adoption was actually serving women, what it actually meant in the lives of pregnant people who were trying to figure out a path forward for themselves. So I started doing the first round of data collection in 2010. And then I did 10-year follow-up data collection in 2020. And then Roe v. Wade was overturned, and a lot of other people wanted to understand these issues about how adoption functions in reproductive politics and from a reproductive justice perspective. And that was where the book came out. That was a very long answer, but
Now I heard you say that when the Dobbs decision was anticipated or maybe came out, that your publisher said we need to get this book out.
Yeah, I'm on the West Coast, right? So the Dobbs oral arguments were like really early in the morning for me here. So we had them, we were listening, as one does, listening to the Supreme Court oral arguments. So I'm like trying to feed my kids breakfast and get them out the door to school. And Justice Coney Barrett keeps asking all these questions about like, why do we need access to abortion if people can just terminate their parental rights? And I'd been like sitting on the book proposal for a year while I tried to figure out what I wanted to do with it. And my husband turns to me and he goes, I think you should send out your proposal today, maybe.
Right.
And I think that it took what could have been like a really specific academic book, and kind of made a lot more people, particularly people on the political left, open to a conversation that they hadn't been before.
Right. And then, so the book's title is Relinquished, and then I don't have the rest of it memorized, but Relinquished really stood out.
It's a long title.
No, I think it's sort of standard how books these days are titled. You have a fairly splashy one word or two words, and then the sort of context of what it's about, which all fit. But I was wondering how you came up with that title, Relinquished, because in some, and this may segue into what words, and you have this in an appendix in the book, what words that you were careful how to use or not use, or put context in when you use them. So let's start with the title first, Relinquished.
Yeah. So the title, well, first, okay, I always tell this story because I think it shows like how these things evolve. The original title for the book was called Choosing Life, because it was supposed to be a direct response to this sort of anti-abortion narrative around adoption. And then Gloria Steinem had read like an early proposal. My agent wanted her to blurb it, and Gloria said, "Well, I can't blurb it with that title because people will think I'm endorsing an anti-abortion project." And I was like, "Well, then I can change the title." And so then it was a question of like, well, what is going to be sort of less obscure? And I landed on Relinquished because for me, it reflected where a lot of the mothers that I had interviewed were coming from, which was sort of a position of not having a lot of power or control over their own lives at the time that the adoptions were happening. And I liked it. I liked it in the past tense because I think it gives some ambiguity. It both reflects like their own relinquishment, their own sort of surrender to circumstances that came through in a lot of their stories, but it can also apply to their children, right? It has this ambiguity over what is being relinquished, and it is their parental rights, it is their relationship with their child. And so I always say, like, while my book isn't about the experiences of adopted people, I like that it sort of had, it can apply to both mother and child and the adopted person as they grow up. But gosh, I mean, and I know you, I don't have to tell you all, right? Like the language around adoption is really fraught. And a lot of the mothers that I interviewed for the book didn't use the word relinquish. And they were still using, especially women who were much like temporally closer to their adoptions, they were still using agency language, right? Like because that the agency, the experience of the agencies was still the basis for their understanding of the adoption. So they were still using choosing adoption and placement, and that didn't actually feel right to me in hearing their stories. I saw someone in the chat that surrendered. Yeah, some of them did use surrender, some of them used place, some of them used relinquished. I had to figure out which one of those made the most sense as a title. And like, I will also say, like, I'm using the language of birth mother. I know that a lot of I try to use mother whenever possible. I also write it as two, and this is all in the appendix, right? I write it as two words so that it's a descriptor rather than a one word title. Nothing is going to fit everyone's experience. It's certainly not going to reflect the experience of all the participants. If they had a strong preference for the words used, I did use those words to describe them. So some mothers describe themselves as a mother of adoption loss, a natural mother. Most of them were actually okay with birth mother. I know that some mothers, particularly like baby scoop era mothers, really have a lot of discomfort with that word. Most of the women I interviewed didn't. They were okay with it. And I think that some of that is a reflection of the extent to which agencies are shaping language around adoption. But I think that all of the women that I interviewed relinquished between 2000 and 2020. And for most of them in that generation, they felt okay with it. They didn't consider that it had the same like stigma or that it was met derisively, as I know some mothers of previous generations have felt. So
Yeah, it was,
um,
even the work we do in advocacy, it's hard to, I mean, you're trying to build coalitions, and sometimes it's hard to get the terms that people really want. I just a really recent example, we were putting together a letter that birth mothers would sign, and one of the organizations said, no, it has to be surrendered a child for adoption, and so that became the phrase. And so I totally understand how fraught that is, and it's something that I assume we just listen to what's preferred, and that really comes across in the book, where you can tell along the ways who really wants a certain term because that's how they're referred to. So that's I really was interesting to see that.
yeah, I was actually surprised because I did ask them all. I said, like, what word do you use to describe yourself? And most of them said birth mother, but I was actually struck by like the number of them who had never thought about it. They're like, oh, birth mother, because like what else would it be? Right. And so I think again, this speaks to the extent to which like the people who have power in controlling the narratives about adoption, including the words we use, are not always the most impacted
Right.
people.
Right.
Um, so it's imperfect. It's an imperfect solution. I try to acknowledge that throughout the book and be careful with the words that I'm using, but
Well,
you
it's
do the
interesting
best you can.
too. So I'm wondering, and this sort of gets us off track, but as you say, these are people who relinquished fairly recently. I'm wondering, are you planning to go back in 2025 or 2030? Is that or you just want to get through touring and getting this book
Yeah.
out?
Well, so I mean, some of the mothers asked me, like, "Are we going to hear from you again in 10 more years?" I was like, "I don't know, maybe." Well, I was like, first I was like, "No," then I was like, "Well, maybe we'll
Right.
see. We'll see where this conversation goes." I will say that the reason why I wanted to go back and interview them after 10 years was because I noticed this pattern in my original interviews in the 2010 data. that mothers who were closer to their adoption, so if they were only 1, 2, 3, 4 years out, they felt like more optimistic. They felt more positively about their adoptions. And so the question for me at that point was, do they feel better about the adoptions because adoption has gotten better? Or do they feel more positively about the adoptions because they are closer to it, because they don't have that sort of time distance to frame it more broadly, and or to see how it plays out? And so that's why I wanted to interview the same group of people 10 years later. And you know, the answer is quite obviously the latter, right? That they, the more time they had between where they were in the adoption, the more critically, the more cynical they were about the role that adoption played in their own lives and the lives of their children. So given that all that changed in 10 years, I can, you know, they're not going to feel better about it in 10 more is what I would guess. So I would have to think about what the research question would be, but I'm not going to rule it out.
Yeah, but in many ways, I mean, with abortion restricted in so many states now, or so many more states, and you know, this rise of the baby boxes and the ability to simply hand your baby over without any kind of regulation, I'm wondering what, and we'll get to this question actually, what the future of adoption is going to look like in the future for adopted people. So yeah, I would love to see that happen, but obviously it's it's a ways away, and you've got something to do right now. So
I
um,
do.
and so I happen to get both the hard copy and the Audible book, and partially because I often don't have time to read, and so I just find moments where I can listen. And I was really struck because you interviewed I think 77 total in 2020, and I think nine are prominently featured in the book. But what's so great about what you did with Audible was it is in a different voice than the narrator, and these are actors that are reading these women's own words. So I'm wondering, could you tell me a little bit about how you developed that, or how much you were involved in the development of the Audible book? And also, I'm wondering, did the actors who did the voiceovers listen to interviews you had with these women and sort of were able to capture their voice and their intonations?
Yeah. I mean, for like research ethic reason, I can't, like, I couldn't share the original recording. So
Uh,
they didn't, but I think, so first of all, like originally, and this was, I had a fairly smooth experience with the publishing process, but this was probably the most drama that I created was during around the audiobook, because I was really adamant that they needed to be in different voices. And I think that part of that, I mean, that was really as a feminist researcher, that was really important to me, because I wanted it to be understood that these weren't my stories, right? The book is quite literally a collection of voices, right? And I have curated it, right? But it was very important to me that it sound like the collection of voices that I really wanted it to be. And so when we did auditions for the voices for the first person narratives, I was certainly remembering how, because I mean, these were stories that were told to me. These were, especially all the 2020 interviews, obviously, were over the phone because it was in the middle of a pandemic. Some of the 2020 or some of the 2010 ones were in person, and I had listened to them so many times that I was really drawn in hearing the voices that were auditioning to ones that really resonated with me, based on hearing these stories. And so that was important, and I'm glad that it has worked really well for people who are listening to the audiobook. You know, it was like I said, that it was important to me, like, as both for what the book is, and they were also like, well, do you want to read them? I was like, no, if I wanted one, like, you know, 30 something white woman to read it, like, I would let the professionals do it. But I really wanted it to feel not just like to have like racially and ethnically diverse set of actresses that were giving voice to the participants, but also age, right? Like, some of these women that I spoke with were quite young, right? They sound very different in telling their stories. And again, I wanted listeners to have that experience of hearing these stories as close as possible to how I had heard them.
right. Yeah, it came across really well, and it really was remarkable to listen to. And I encourage people who either prefer Audible or is to get it. It's a great reading. It's a great book to listen to on Audible. Um, so one thing I remember when I was first starting the book was sort of the foundation you're already working on. And that foundation immediately came to mind. I think it is mentioned in the book as well, is Anne Fessler's The Girls Who Went Away, and then also the work of Ricky Solinger and her two books, Beggars and Choosers, and I think the other one is Wake Up Little Susie. But and you know, I devoured. I mean, that was my first, I think, foray into reading about adoption in a more critical context was Ann Fessler's book, who was an adoptee, but she was interviewing birth mothers. But what I came out of in listening to your book and reading your book was maybe things haven't really changed that much since the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It's just a different power dynamic. It's the same dominant narrative. The marketing and technology and the terms may have changed, but the underlying concept of adoption hasn't changed so much if you compare the conversations you're having with women who relinquished and the women that were sent away
Yeah.
in Fessler's book. So I'm wondering what you thought about, if you thinking back to your understanding of adoption and through Ann Fessler and Ricky Solinger,
Mhm.
what you thought about with the women you were interviewing about adoption.
So Anne, I mean, Anne's work was like really foundational to my own work. And you know, I view this as really continuing the conversation that she started in Girls Who Went Away. Um, and that's also part of the reason why I included the first person narratives, because I thought that they were so important to Girls Who Went Away that I tried to bring that structure into it. Um, you know, Ricky and Ricky has been a amazing mentor too. And for people who haven't engaged with her work, it's really excellent. Um, so they, you know, they're mostly talking about the pre-row baby scoop era. And I think that the 2010 interviews mirror that fairly closely, not in exactly the same way. And also I should say, in 2010, I also interviewed baby scoop era birth mothers. I just didn't resample for them for the 2020 sample. So those women were still mostly white women, right? So the baby scoop era was almost entirely white women. And really that reflected the demographic data that we knew about relinquishing mothers up through the 90s, that these were majority white women. There was very low participation for women of color in domestic adoption. And part of that is that like communities of color have always had better systems of kinship support. They've had less stigma around single motherhood. And so but there was also not as much of a market for children of color, the same way that the market forces operated on white children. Families of color weren't protected from family separation. It just didn't happen as much in the private adoption system. So I want to be clear on that. And a lot of these white girls and young women were relinquishing as a way of delaying parenthood, right? You're not married. This isn't the appropriate time for you to be parenting. So you're going to relinquish your first child and then you're going to forget all about it and you're going to go on with your life and you're going to get married and you're going to have children in a more appropriate context. These were also mostly like middle class girls and young women, because they felt particular pressure around this racialized classed narrative of what appropriate parenthood looked like. So that was sort of the debate, and that really carried I mean, that was really what private adoption system looked like through the early 2000s. And so the 2010 sample reflected that. In the 2020 sample, I had far more women of color that participated. And when I looked back, I also collected data on about 8,000 adoptions that occurred between 2011 and 2020 and found a far higher representation of women of color participating in that system than we had found in previous generations, right? And this is part of this is like the gap in how we understand adoption that comes from just not having comprehensive data collection on adoption. We don't count these on a federal level. We don't have demographic data on a federal level. So when I did this sort of large scale demographic survey, it was only about 55% white women that were participating in the private system so far, whereas before it had been like over 90%. So we're seeing more and more women of color relinquishing through the private system. But at the same time, the uniting factor for participating in the private system is no longer about changing the timeline on which one, delaying parenthood in some ways. It is more and more about poverty and lack of capacity. So the majority of relinquishing mothers today are actually relinquishing subsequent children. They're already parenting, they already have children at home. And it's a question of whether or not they have the resources to care for an additional child.
Yeah. One of the things that you talk about in the book, which you get into real detail, which I was found fascinating and awful at the same time. And maybe you could talk about a little bit the sophistication of the recruitment of women who may or may not be pregnant. Could you talk a little bit about what you were able to find, and also about online searching? And was that a surprise to you, or was that something you already knew that was happening?
I think that the intentionality of the marketing was really new to me. Um, or not new, but like, I mean, it's a newer practice, right? And I think that the ability to target advertising has only become sharper in the last 10 years, 15 years since I started this work. I think that that is like, so a lot of what I document in the book are the ways that really vulnerable pregnant people are targeted by ads for adoption agencies. So geofencing of reproductive health centers, methadone clinics, public hospitals, WIC sites with adoption advertising. The ways that adoption agencies will buy Google ads for things that have nothing to do with adoption. So if you Google, help for single moms in California, you're going to start getting ads for local adoption agencies. How to get on WIC in Maryland, right? You're going to get ads for, adoption agencies in that region. And I think that the ability to really target people in that way is really key. And most people don't realize that marketing is usually the biggest or second biggest line item for a lot of adoption agencies. So, it's like legal fees, marketing, support for birth parents right down here. And I think that that is really key because this is a supply and demand system, right? You have really, really, really high demand for babies and children, and you have really low supply. And I'm using this market language and because I think I'm not to be flippant, right? But because I think it's important to understand the ways that it is a market shaped system. There is a supply and demand. And when you have really high demand and you have a really low number of infants that are available for adoption, agencies are very, very motivated to find ways of targeting vulnerable pregnant people with their advertising. And so I think that that is really key. And that's really what underlies so much of the marketing that we see around
Could
adoption.
could you talk a little bit about geofencing, because I found that fascinating. I probably knew
Yeah.
about it, but I hadn't thought about it in the context of essentially convincing pregnant people to consider adoption.
Yeah. No, so the geofencing, and there was a case. It's kind of funny to me because I like funny in a grim way, not in a haha way. Because I got this advertising company that was doing geofencing sent out this email blast to anyone who had ever published anything on adoption, I guess, which included me. And I basically put the whole email in the book. The last line of the email is like, if you're not the appropriate person to contact, like, let us know who at your organization is. And I was like, well, I was not the appropriate person to contact, but here is the full email because what they believe, they so believe that what they are doing is like good work, right? That they don't even have a moment of like being chagrined here. And what they're really doing is people who go to reproductive health centers, particularly abortion clinics, who they'll target the geo coordinates on their phones for people who have visited these spaces to get adoption ads. So a lot of, I work in the OBGYN department. A lot of my colleagues who are abortion providers, they get these ads all the time because they are constantly in these spaces. So they can really pin down your physical coordinates of where your phone is for targeted advertising. You'll see this too if you're traveling, right? Like if you're in a different city, suddenly you'll start getting ads for things that are happening in that city for tourist attractions in that city. So it's not just adoption advertising, but they're really focused. It's a tool that they also use. They also use virtual geofencing. So if you are continually looking at like WIC resources, public housing resources, anything that suggests that you are pregnant and in a vulnerable position, they'll do virtual geofencing to target ads to people who are visiting those sites as well.
And what are these ads saying? Are they saying we can help, or are you
Oh
pregnant,
yeah,
or
they're saying, yeah, are you like if you're pregnant and worried, like we can help. Adoption is available. I mean, a lot of and it's not just agencies. A lot of prospective adoptive parents have their own websites. They take their own classes on SEO, search engine optimization, right? And they'll buy search terms as well, and they'll start getting, so they'll get ads not just from agencies, but from prospective adoptive families that really showcase them and their homes and their lifestyle and their families as desirable places for children. And a lot of these profiles, whether they're provided by an agency or whether pregnant people are finding them other ways, really speak to a lot of the reasons that people are relinquishing in the first place, right?
Right.
A lot of mothers were relinquishing because they didn't have a reliable parent or a reliable partner with whom they could co-parent, right? And so the adoptive family profiles will like feature their wedding photos, right? And talk about their loving and supportive relationship. A lot of mothers might be looking at relinquishing because their own parents, their own families aren't supportive of them raising this child. Well, here are, the adoptive families' parents who can't wait to be grandparents, and here is their family dinners, right? Or mothers might be relinquishing because they don't have stable housing. Well, here is their gorgeous home in the suburbs with a big backyard and outdoor space to play and nearby schools, right? And so it's really a distinct contrast between the reasons that pregnant people might be looking at or considering adoption. What's missing in their own lives is really highlighted in these profiles. And so many of the women I interviewed felt really infatuated with a lot of the parents that the prospective parents that they were in conversation with, and after the adoptions as well, they felt intimidated by them in a lot of ways because they had this sort of like that's what they said, this like picture perfect lifestyle. That was one of the quotes from some of my participants, really starstruck in a lot of ways by these families. So,
And and part of that process that it really comes across in the book is this concept. It's not a concept. This reality of pre-birth matching, where you get to pick them out of profiles, and you're matched with these parents. But it really becomes a psychological tool. In how I read your book, that these women who are pregnant and are going to give birth and then relinquish that child to these parents feel like they are going to disappoint these parents if they
oh, absolutely.
back out, and so they feel
Yeah.
like they have to go through with it.
I mean, and this is where, people talk about open adoption. And I want to be clear, like open adoption is better than closed. Like I view openness and adoption as a harm reduction tool, right? Adopted people in open adoptions do better than adoptees in closed adoptions. Birth mothers, relinquishing mothers in open adoptions do somewhat better than relinquishing mothers in closed adoptions, right? I don't want to like overstate it, but it is less harmful to have some contact or at least some awareness that your child is safe and healthy for these mothers than it might have be. There are a million caveats to that. I don't want to make it sound like open, like, oh, open adoption is open now, everything's better. Like, no, that's not what I'm saying. But part of the challenge of this is that in order to have a lifelong, productive, adoptee-centered open adoption arrangement, you need to know the future parents of this child, right? And having those conversations in a robust, communicative way is the only way to make sure these are people that you can have that relationship with.
Right.
This pre-birth matching was often became a way that pregnant people felt that they owed this couple, and it was almost always a couple, but these prospective parents their child, right? And one mother I interviewed talked about like going out to dinner with her son's prospective adoptive parents while she was still pregnant. And they have had their 4-year-old with them, and the 4-year-old at dinner is like drawing a picture on the placemat, like, oh, this is you, and this is my baby brother in your belly, right? And this sort of way that she felt indebted to not just the parents, but to the child, to their whole family, to the extent that she felt that she'd be letting them down if she didn't give them her child. And I think that was really, a lot of mothers felt that very acutely.
Yeah, I think that is something that you talk about towards the end of the book, is what do people want to change in pre-birth matching was one of the things that they thought was detrimental to their experience as well. This kind of gets us to the next question, which is your book, the woman is named Megan. You don't use their real names except for one, which is surprising at the end. The context is clear why. But Megan was really a compelling story for me to read because she was one of two, I think, that didn't have her idea about adoption or her thoughts about adoption hadn't gotten worse, and everyone else
Yeah.
over time had gotten worse. Everyone else that you had interviewed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And hers was that it was this very open, very engaged relationship with the adoptive parents, but also her child, as if it was a family. I mean, it became this family. And I thought of, well, this is what kinship adoption may look like if it's really done well. I mean, it's always dependent upon how the adoptive parents generally accept and allow this kind of engagement. I'm wondering, could kinship adoption be sort of a model of what adoption would be like if people agree that adoption is something we should do?
Yeah, I don't know if I mean, and I know a lot of people on this call don't like agree, like I don't see an inherent value in this, right? And I'm not suggesting that you're saying that that this is a practice that we should be like motivated to continue. What I think was unique about Megan's story, and I'll just read a little bit of Megan's story,
Sure.
because I think it was really unique, and I think that it kind of challenges us to question a lot of how we think about adoption. So this was right after Megan signed her termination papers.
Quick note that we substituted the narrated version of the Audible book so you can get an idea of what the book sounds like.
The night after Megan signed her termination of parental rights, she was riven with anxiety and couldn't sleep. I was just so worried. I didn't know how everything was going, so I called to check, and Donna was like, "Why don't you come over? You'll probably feel better when you see her in her new home." I was like, "I can do that?" She's like, "Sure. It's up to us. The three of us figure out how this works. Come on over." I went over there. It really helped because I got to see her. She was home and she was okay. I saw her in her little bassinet, so I knew exactly how she was doing. From there, I didn't see her too much at the beginning. It was about a month before I saw her again. I basically told Donna and Rich, "I don't want an issue, but I do think you need to bond as a family," because I didn't want to seem too pushy. Rich was just like, "It's fine. You're our family now. Anytime you want to come over, just give us a call." I kind of stayed away a bit because it was hard on me to see her. Those were like the weird years. Like, I was having a lot of trouble with the adoption. It was emotional, obviously. I mean, a major loss. Your little girl. By the time Chloe was 3, though, it turned around. I started to see her more and more. I got married soon after, and she was my flower girl. Chloe would grow up just about 20 minutes away from Megan, whom she called Auntie Meg, and Megan was a part of the family. Not only did she show up for Chloe's ballet recitals, but she tagged along for Chloe's brother's baseball games. She joined family beach vacations. She watched 4th of July fireworks and dyed Easter eggs. She came along to the mall for back-to-school shopping or got a text if they were in a park nearby. There was little about how Megan's adoption happened that set her on a better path. It didn't need to work out that way, and for most of the women I interviewed, it didn't. But whatever kismet conspired to bring Megan, Donna, and Rich together would ultimately let them build a foundation that would serve them well. A decade later, Megan felt they were only closer. Donna would babysit Megan's nieces and nephews after school. Rich would lend Megan his large SUV to pick up items at the hardware store. It's really just extended family at this point. The biggest thing is that it is just like any other relationship. It grows, it changes, and ours just happened to work out like this. It's not forced. I'm closer with them than I am with my own sister. We just clicked. But you can't plan on that. You can't plan on luck. Megan recognizes that her comparatively good fortune is independent of the system. Donna doesn't look at me like the vessel that produced her child, and she knows that Chloe needs me in her life. Once, when Chloe was about 10, she asked if she could call me Mom. And I said, well, that's something you should talk to your mom about. Because I knew Donna would be like, yeah, call her Mom if you want. But I also told her that Donna was doing the work of taking care of her every day, and that made her fully Chloe's mom, too. Chloe's mothers were able to validate each other and recognize that Chloe needed them both. And Donna was able to recognize that her family was predicated on Megan's relinquishment. When they held a party to celebrate the finalization of the adoption, she was conflicted on inviting Megan. She both wanted her there as part of their family, but didn't want Megan to feel as if they were celebrating her loss. Few relinquishing mothers felt that their child's adoptive parents considered their emotional experiences in this way.
So there's a lot going on in this story, a lot going on in this story. And I think it's important that Megan, even though Megan feels positively about her adoption, about her relationship with her daughter, like she still makes a lot of space for her own grief, right? She still says it was really painful to be in contact with her daughter those first few years. But I think what is remarkable to me about this scenario is just how much Chloe's adoptive parents never viewed Megan as a threat, right? She was always fully part of her family. They always had respect for her, not just as someone who had brought their child in the world, but like an inherent respect for her that really came through in her story. And the reason why, but at the same time, Megan says, like, you can't plan on luck, right? You can't, this worked out this way, but there was nothing about the system that worked for or guaranteed this outcome for us. This worked well in our case, but it doesn't mean that the system works well for everyone. But I do think that it gives a suggestion of alternate ways of caring for children by expanding the number of people that care for them. And I think that part of my critique of adoption is just that in addition to all of the harms that can ensue, it's just that it's really deeply uncreative in how it thinks about how we care for people, how we care for kids. Because my, when as soon as you're critical of adoption, and I'm sure you all have heard this, but as soon as you're critical of adoption, people suggest that you want kids to be in unsafe homes, right? Or you don't care about what happens to children. And I actually think that, I mean, of course I do. Of course, that's not my argument. But I think that what this opens up is the idea that you can bring more people together to care for a child. Doesn't necessarily need to involve the termination of parental rights. Now, in Megan's case, it did. Megan has a traditional form of private adoption. But I think it shows that you don't need to separate a child from their family of origin to introduce more people to care for them. And so I hope that it inspires a greater level of thinking broadly about how we care for people.
Right. And I worry sometimes too that those who are super proponents of adoption will use Megan's story as, oh, see, this is how we can do it, and this is what we're after, and this is what we mean by open adoption, when in fact it's very, very rare that it ever works out that way, as you discovered in interviewing these moms. And also, I don't want to suggest this was a kinship adoption. This was and you don't either, that this was a straightforward adoption in which there was no kin. And so there is a big difference between that. And I think when we're talking about kinship adoption, it is typically, it is always someone in the family who knows the child and is stepping up to care for that child. And it doesn't have to be an adoption either. It could just be a temporary method of getting, as happened to all these women in your book, getting them into a better place so they can actually parent. Yeah. Um, I'm curious when, having gone through this, and CS and I bat around the idea of what is the future of adoptees. We call it actually what are future adoptees, and we really don't know. And it's hard to predict. And I'm wondering if have you thought through about the future of adoption and adoptees, both from a perspective of reproductive justice, but also given the realities of this incredibly well-financed, dominant narrative of adoption.
Ooh,
It's a hard one.
yeah. I mean, I like there's the future of adoption that I I would like us all to envision, right? And there's a future of adoption that I think is like practical in the short term and sort of how we advance these narratives. Um, I think that what I am trying to accomplish with this book is not to advance like a really tangible, specific policy agenda. I do that a little bit, but to really encourage people who haven't thought about this a lot to think about the role that adoption plays in our broader culture and who it's ultimately serving, right? And who it's designed to serve. And so when I think about what I want the future of this to look like, but that was probably a more abstract answer than what you were getting to. But I think that we need to envision any future of adoption within that context, because otherwise it's never going to be centered on what children and adopted people actually need.
Right. There are adoptees, many, and others who wish to abolish adoption. But personally, I often see adoption more broadly, and it's partially a product of the family policing, family regulation system, and a lack of real resources, as you say in the book, to parent the child you have. So should our focus on abolition work be about abolishing the family policing, family regulation system first, with adoption obviously impacted by that? Or can you do both at the same time without taking away the power from a largely BIPOC movement to abolish the child welfare system? That's a kind of a
Yeah.
very complicated question, but I'd love to
Yeah.
know what you think.
No, and I mean, it's a great question. I think a little bit of context here, because I think that the historic whiteness of private adoption and obviously the targeted child taking and removal that communities of color and indigenous communities and tribes have faced across American history, which I try to grapple with these sort of dual trajectories in the book for the relinquishment of children in the market system and the targeted removal of children and the threat of removal of children as a way of extracting obedience from BIPOC communities has made it so that the systems have been and have always appeared to be very far apart. And I think that what's happening now is that actually the private adoption system and the family policing system are becoming like increasingly close together because poverty is really such a determinative characteristic in who is targeted for family separation, both in the public and the private system. And I think that it's not just that. It's not just these common sources of oppression that lead to child separation. But like a lot of the mothers that I interviewed had also had experience with the family policing system. So mothers who had lost older children to foster care, who were told by private agencies, well, you should relinquish this baby for a private adoption because then you can choose the parents, then you can have an open adoption. That's what that would look like. Or mothers who were facing a real crisis. I told the story in detail of one mother who was dealing with postpartum psychosis and was really not a safe parent for her child at that time. Her co-parent for her older children had passed away. And she was very worried as a Black woman. She was very worried that if she went to the child welfare system, that they would just remove all of her children, right? Because the child welfare system is so rarely, if ever, about actually protecting children's welfare. And so she was worried that she would lose all of her children if she went there as a place of help, and thus ended up relinquishing the baby in a private adoption in order to keep custody of her older children. So these, and you also see like a lot of the marketing around adoption doesn't clarify whether it is private or public adoption. So there's this idea that we have a shortage of adoptive parents, right? We have a shortage of people that are available to care. We have so many children in need of homes. We have so many children that are available for adoption that fuels the market demand. And this sense of adopting is altruistic, right? So you see more and more commonalities between what's shaping these conversations. When I say that, I'm not trying to diminish the very independent racialized histories of both of these systems, right? But I am suggesting that because of those racialized histories, the commonalities and the ability to build multiracial, cross-racial coalitions has not been as successful. And today, I mean, like as always, it is resting increasingly on adopted people of color and really women of color that are impacted by this system, because these divisions have meant that people haven't been able to see the commonalities in these experiences. So when we're talking about abolition broadly around family separation, I don't see it as separate movements, right? All policies, I mean, there are certainly abolitionist policies to limit the scope of the family regulation system, and those have validity. But I'm really like, I can keep coming back in my very long answer to this question to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's language that abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about what you're building, not about what you're limiting, right? And so what we need to build is a world that values family connection, right? What we need to build is a world that supports families, that provides these opportunities, that makes it possible, as well as limiting the scope of the family policing system, right? But the way to limit that scope is by building out these supports. And so I think that is really valuable. I don't view this as an either or question. I do think that people who are critical of the private system need to have a lot more fluency and a lot more understanding of the family policing system, for sure, because these are not separate questions. But I think that is the only way we're going to build a coalition around this, is if we are thinking about how they are connected rather than how they need to be prioritized.
Right. I agree. I think that it really, in your book, makes clear it's resource driven that makes women either have their children taken from them or feel that they have no other option but to relinquish their children. And if we were to address these very core things, health insurance, housing, basic income, transportation, then those things would, I think, impact the number of adoptions substantially. And I think that may be why we're seeing such a huge upsurge in using artificial or assisted reproductive technology, because maybe the future of adoption is waning. But we also still have to pay attention and address these clear lack of resources for women who need them without being punitive. So I think I have other questions, but I think we need to really open up to questions other people have, not me. So Annette or Shauna or CS, have you been monitoring and have some of the questions that the people have for Gretchen?
There is a question. Gretchen, how would you respond to an adoptive parent who dismisses your book as a bunch of personal anecdotes rather than qualitative data?
I've done a lot of these interviews, right? And I think that even if they are just anecdotes, right? Even if we accept the premise of the question that qualitative data collection is just the assemblage of anecdotes, this is not a reflection of it. Like, even if one of these stories was true, 3 of these stories was true, then there's still a pretty damning indictment of how the overall system is working. That even if only what I have collected here, even if these are the only mothers in the entire country who feel this way about their adoptions, and every other mother is deeply happy with how their adoption has turned out, you still have to think about what it means that these cases can exist. what I actually hear more often is like, oh, well, the people who want to talk about their like people who are really happy aren't going to want to talk about their adoptions. And what I say is a lot of the mothers I interviewed in 2010 were happy. And people are like, oh, well, like you found them like via snowball thing. I was like, well, first of all, but they I mean these a lot of the mothers that you were they were the people that the agencies they were putting on the panels in front of prospective adoptive parents, right? They were writing the Brave Love blog posts, right? Like they were in there deep believing that their adoption was beautiful, perfect, great, with and the fact that these women came to such a critical place, I think demonstrates that this isn't a selection bias, right? I didn't go on like I know Renee is on here and I'm grateful for Renee. I'm grateful to include her words in the book, but like I didn't go to Saving Our Sisters and say like send me all the miserable, unhappy
Right.
mothers, right?
You're a
Like
researcher. Yeah.
I went to spaces where I found people who had like a range of beliefs around their adoption. It was just over time that they came to a more uniform place. Look, people are going to find ways to dismiss anything that makes them uncomfortable. So I'm going to get a lot of feedback from anti-abortion people who don't like the book. I'll get a lot of people who are really devoted to their understanding of what adoption is, who don't want to question that, who don't like the book, including adoptive parents. I think I've made the best case that I can.
I get a little uneasy and reproductive justice issues coming into the context of adoption because on a very narrow issue, the birth record, for instance, our birth record, we have seen opposition, strong opposition from white-led, you call them second wave feminists,
Yeah.
saying that it is a reproductive issue or justice issue that we should be able to say, no, you cannot have your birth record because it's private and we should not be revealed as a mother. And I'm wondering if you have any insight
Yeah.
into that.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to draw a delineation between like reproductive rights work, which is sort of what you're talking about, which is this white-led second wave feminism choice-based framework, which has always understood adoption as like this is a valid choice, right? If women choose adoption, then this is fine, right? And it has never been accountable to adopted people at all, right? It's never considered that part of its work, as opposed to the reproductive justice movement, which was actually entirely shaped by women of color and really Black women, as a response to the reproductive rights movement, and that asserts like a positive need to support families and communities. And I think that is a really important distinction, because I actually think that reproductive rights as a legal based framework doesn't offer a lot more when it comes to adoption. Whereas the reproductive justice movement, which asserts a right to parent children in safe communities, to parent the children that you have, is a much more intuitive space for a consideration of adoption. And it has been led by women of color. So those connections are going to be more readily made. But there's also this difference also between reproductive justice as a theory, which is what I'm talking about as being a ready fit for incorporating adoption, and reproductive justice as a movement. And the reason why reproductive justice as a movement hasn't incorporated a lot more organizing thought building around adoption is, I think, because of this these different racialized trajectories around family separation, right? And the fact that they view family defense and family preservation only within the family policing system, and it doesn't include an incorporation of private adoption. That being said, I draw on a lot of adoptee activists in the book who have already been doing other work in the reproductive justice movement, that are now surfacing their needs as adopted people within that space, right? And saying like, now it's time to consider what this means. And so I think we're at a turning point. I think that this movement building is going to happen. I have seen, I'm in a lot of RJ spaces. That is my movement home. I've seen a lot of really exciting progress happening there to move us away from, a culture of legal rights, and more into a justice-based framework for understanding how all of these issues are entwined.
I really appreciate that explanation. I mean, I think I saw a reproductive justice framework being used in Colorado recently, where there's a baby box bill, and two organizations that were very specifically reproductive justice organizations opposed it, and they really educated the legislators and me too on what that meant, and it was very much what you just described. So I see a really positive future with that. So thank you.
You have one more question out there too. After writing this book and the interviews, where do you stand on the question, what does ethical adoption mean to you? And are ethical adoptions achievable?
I mean, I get asked this question a lot. I did like an author Q&A where someone was like, can adoption be ethical? And I literally just sat there for a moment to like figure out how I wanted to articulate the response. And the reporter literally put that in like long pause in the interview transcript when they did the Q&A. I mean, I think any world in which children are commodified, you cannot have ethical adoption. I think as long as children are commodified, you cannot get to a place where it's truly ethical. That being said, and the caveat that I always give is that I know and I see ethical people that are participating in the adoption system that are coming from a values aligned perspective and a fair amount of ignorance in how they do this. But it doesn't matter how ethical individual players are if the system is rooted in inequity and commodification of human beings. I mean, that is increasing. That's just where I have to come to after hearing these stories, after understanding the history. I don't see where you come to a different conclusion. It's important to remember that the way adoption is practiced today is fairly historically new, right? We've only been doing it this way for like at the long end 150 years. And the ways that we have found to care for children and families in other ways predates that dramatically, particularly in indigenous communities and communities of color. Like they've all found other ways of addressing the same needs throughout history. And we've been doing this for far less longer than we were doing everything else. And so there are other ways of finding these supports and care for people that don't look anything like what we're doing today.
I think that's a great place to stop. And Gretchen, I really, really appreciate you sitting down with us. I wish you all the luck with the book. I hope more people read it.
No, I also just want to say, I'm really grateful to be here, and I want to be clear. Like, I know we have the drawing, and I would love to have folks buy the book. It's hugely successful to getting the narrative out there. But like, I also am clear, like these stories belong to relinquishing parents. They belong to adoptees, and so if this is not something that you can afford, like reach out to me. Like I want you to have access to these stories. Everyone in this, I don't make this offer broadly because I don't want to hear from like adoptive parents who want to get a copy, but certainly adoptees, birth parents who are interested and can't afford it, like please reach out to me. I am grateful for the opportunity to be in community with you and want this to feel accessible to you.
Thanks, Gretchen. It's really generous. What Next is written and hosted by me, Gregory Luce, and is a production of Adoptees United, Inc., a national nonprofit charitable organization dedicated to equality for all adopted people. Please follow, subscribe, and rate us wherever you get your podcasts, and sign up for the newsletter at adopteesunited.org/whatnext. And consider supporting us with a tax-deductible donation at adopteesunited.org/donate. Anything you provide helps us keep the lights on. See you next time.